I would now like to hand over to the moderator you'll see after the break, Dr. Angelica Hilbeck. Thank you very much to the speakers so far. They will appear again after the break, and Angelica will lead you into the break before we have the break.
Exactly, that shall happen. Hello, everybody from my side. Good to see you or not see you, and hope to see you all after the break. And I will kick off then the debate among the participants or among the presenters. And then hopefully pretty quickly after that, we will also engage you in the debate, and you will be able to make oral statements or to post oral questions there as well. We kept it right now to the written part when it was about clarifications. The next one is now really about engaging in a conversation, also in a conversation with you. And we believe that even though we cannot be in the same room as persons and as people, we do want to hear your voice, but we cannot unfortunately see your camera. That the technology doesn't allow us to do that, but we do want you in the room by your voice. So I look forward to it. Take a break, have a coffee, but do come back, because I think some of the more interesting or really interesting questions that might not have been addressed now will come during the roundtable discussion. So I'll see you in, Diederik.
Half an hour at 4 o'clock exactly.
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock Central European time, that is. I hope you can calculate what it is for you.
You have to do the math on your own. All right. I know this is asking a lot from you to stay in front of a screen for so many hours and listen to talking heads on your screen. But that's the way we can do it now in these days. But it also gave us the opportunity to reach out to a whole range of people that we could have never gotten into one room. So this is also a positive thing about it. My name is Angelica Hilbeck. I am a researcher and lecturer at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Switzerland. And you see me in my lovely disorderly office. While I think Michael is also in his office, but everybody else is in home office. This is my real office, not my home office. My home looks a bit different, so take it for what it is. And I don't have a background screen. I want to explain to you a little bit how this all came about. Diederik kept it short at the beginning, but I still feel, having now listened to a lot of explanation of why context matters, I think you should be knowing the context, why ENSSER, for those who know what we do, and notice that we haven't come out with any statement or any event on the ongoing pandemic, which is clearly the most significant event in this year and for the next years to come. So how come that we have not made a statement about it or haven't had an event? And there is reasons for that. And it is because we do know what it means to enter a polarized debate. And we are, as Ignacio put it, field tested when it comes to that. So we're not shy of debating, but we have enough experience to know how careful you have to be and when to enter and how to enter. And we hope that this is a sensible way of entering the debate. One of our biggest concerns from the get-go was, or we all noticed that right from the get-go, the debate was highly, highly polarized, was framed in a very particular way, where it was like within the first few weeks, it was impossible to change that frame. So we had to kind of let go. We are not in the position of changing these global frames of pitching and portraying and contextualizing what was going on. So we had to stand back, monitor the unfolding of the pandemic, see what is happening, and then come out after a due period of reflection. We feel this is the time now. So whether it is a birth certificate, as one of our members calls it, of that virus that was highly polarized, debated to this very day, or whether it was that the framing was right from the get-go in military terms. So you knew right away you're entering a combat field. You're entering a minefield. It was the virus, the evil, the plague, the whatever have you, the devil, versus us, the humans, who had to fight and combat. Leaders of our nations were pitching it as a war we were engaging, and European leaders. And just like with every war, when you hear we're at war, you know, with every war that was ever fought on planet Earth, the first victims of war are truth and independent inquiry. And so we knew immediately there's no way you can enter this debate now without falling on either side of it. And we didn't feel ready to fall on either side. So there is only enemy and friend. And you had the only way you could enter it by deciding on which side you fall. Arguments in either direction, as Ignacio has put it, became immediately weaponized and were used to shoot at dissenters with the intention of destroying the message. We, many people, many members of ENSSER know what it means to be a dissenter and what it means to be the target for discrediting campaigns to shoot the messenger of inconvenient truths. So the media did its share on this as well. And it was, for me, a personal surprise to see how uniform and how unisono the media was choosing sides and weren't even pretending not to. So their share of their way of reporting was accelerating the polarization, opening the floodgates for sensational reporting, and hitting the panic button as a default mode of reporting. Media reporting therefore became embedded in either side of it. And to a certain extent, it is like this to this very day. However, we had to sort of reflect on it. What is our take on it? So we stood back, let the gun smoke settle, and did seek for other colleagues in our circles who still cared and were also looking for peers of reflection who had not yet decided on which side of the whole debate on the polarized forth and back we fell. So we engaged in weekly events, coffee chats we called them, and used it as sounding boards, pitched our ideas, researched for the evidence, and came up with what Ignacio then presented as the landscape of questions and issues of inquiries and fields where we felt we don't have the answers yet, but we may never get the answers on, and how do we weigh them, how do we structure them, and how do they all come together? Now, this doesn't mean we have any answer to that, okay? But we feel we can come forward now with presenting it this way. And trying, mainly that, trying to create the space and carve out the space that allows for this debate, because that is something we have been missing to this very day. The space where you can create based on evidence, based on reasoned debate, what is going on, which issues need to be researched, which issues need to be discussed and brought together. For me now, for the debate, we've heard now 3 people have given their input. We have other people who could input. It was kind of a decision-making process where we felt we start. We may continue doing this. We may have other events like that. It depends a little bit how this goes here this time. So it's an experiment we're doing. And I chose 2 issues that I feel are at the core, a core field of inquiry and discourse for our members. And these are the 2 issues of framing and the precaution. These are fields where we have had decades of experience. How are our fields of inquiry, our fields of science and research, how are they framed? And we have always stood for precaution, or for precautionary principle, and are standing behind the implementation of this to this very day. So these are things and issues where we feel we can make a contribution, and we have mature thinking that we can offer for debate. Framing is mainly regarding, and you might have heard it a little bit already coming out of the presentation you've heard, is SARS-CoV-2, the virus, the cause of the pandemic? Is the pandemic our problem? Or are these symptoms of much deeper running systemic problems that in totality generate the enabling conditions for epi and pandemics to occur in the first place? From that non-trivial question, arises, what really then constitutes precautionary action? And is what we're doing right now anywhere near that? Or are we getting confused with damage control? I have put together a little table that I may share with you. It's very informal, so none of this has went through peer review. In fact, none of my peers ever saw it, so this is the first kind of peer review I do. And we'll show you some of the thinking that I had, depending whether you see the virus as a cause of all evil now, or whether you see it as a symptom of a deeper running problem. So for me, the focus, or you would have to answer some of the questions differently, or I would, and you can, and please, the panelists, use this as inspiration for our debate. If you focus your attention, if you think it's the cause, you combat the virus, and it's the virus versus you. So you go for cure, you go for vaccine, you have a very limited line of actions you can take. But predominantly you do host management. And host management is what I call what we're doing right now with all the actions, with distancing, with isolation of people, with disinfection, etc. So we have to manage us because we cannot combat viruses, right? We don't have treatments against them, or we don't have a vaccine. The vaccine would be the only effective treatment. Or if you see it as a symptom, you would ask other questions. You would maybe go, or at least not lose sight of, the structural anthropogenic determinants that produce the virus, economic, political, legal, physical, etc., and will continue to do so because the next pandemic is just looming around the corner. And then you would think maybe differently about your host management actions you do, that while they are pitched, all of them are pitched to us as precaution from things happening, really what they are then, if you view it as a symptom, as damage control. So we're long gone with the precaution, but if we want to capture back precaution, what would we have to do? And you would maybe take a different view on the collateral damage that all the actions we're doing are having. Right now, we're sacrificing those collateral damage. We're saying they are less relevant for the sake of the higher goal to stop the spread of this deadly virus, and therefore it must be pitched as if it were the plague, which it is not. Or you would say collateral damage is highly relevant. Increasing death rates due to collateral damage is an equal evil and must be at least, must require consent of those affected, which must require participation and debate, having a say in it. We were not asked. As Ignacio said, I also had 3 days. I was told on a Friday afternoon that on Monday afternoon, my teaching had to be online. So nobody was consulted, and we didn't participate in the making of these measurements that were taken. Which expertise do you need to bring to the table? Well, if you only combat a virus, all you need are virologists, epidemiologists, and their closely related disciplines. If you see it as a symptom, you need a whole lot more people taking seat at the table and discussing the measures you want to take. Where would your focus of spending go? Well, if it's the only cause that you go after is the virus, your spending goes on vaccines, therapies, protection gear. If you think it's a symptom of deeper running cause, you would go after the structural determinants. At least you would not spend all of your money on vaccines and therapies, which is exactly what we're doing right now. The focus of research wouldn't be only on vaccines and therapies and protection, because it would target those structural determinants. And for the structural determinants, we have in our discussion groups identified at least 3. And one is what has been earlier mentioned, industrial livestock factories, for example, serving as evolutionary incubators for novel pathogens, doing the passaging that Michael Antoniou has been explaining to us all the time, 24/7. The environmental encroachment, habitat destruction, creating forced zones of encounter, where it becomes very easy for zoonosis to make the jump and the crossing to humans. Or having the gains of functional bioweapon research that we're seeing in biosecurity issues, regardless what it is, all of those are structural determinants that create the enabling environment for viruses to spread, to proliferate, and to evolve. What really is then precautionary action? And that is what I want to put forward to my panelists now, and also to the participants in this round. What really would precautionary action look like if we would finally move away from viewing the virus as the only cause and problem we have, and look more at it as a symptom of the deeper running issues that we're having. So with that, I would like to start, or maybe I dare to show you a few slides also that I've put together just as the recent numbers. I just cut and paste the numbers from today of our infections, new cases, and new death rates. So this is France, and this is Belgium, two prominent cases right now. Well, you can look at it this way. If you cut,
we're not seeing the screen, Angelica. No.
Did you not see?
You need to stop sharing and start again.
Ah, okay.
We're still on your table.
Okay, these are the latest numbers of new cases and new death rates. I have to apologize, it was a German, but the curves speak by itself. Now you can look at those curves. There's a lot of information in those curves. What do they tell you? If you look at the first part of the pandemic, there was a nice correlation, if you wish, between infection rate, PCR test value of SARS-CoV-2, leading to the manifestation of the disease, COVID. If you look at the second part, what we're seeing everywhere in Europe right now, almost everywhere, that relationship is not obvious anymore, isn't it? Now you can pitch only these numbers and focus everything you do, your entire measure or actions on PCR test values, like here, or you can go by the presentation of COVID and try to understand what has been happening there. We're doing this, we're focusing on PCR test values. Is that the most clever way of doing things? These are some other numbers, Spain and Denmark, for example. Is it a good predictor? This is Sweden, a country that shows different measures. Interesting information that is in between these two curves. This is Germany and Switzerland looking pretty much the same. Also here the question, what is a good predictor for another one? But then there is something like this, there's Israel, where you have apparently a good prediction. So are infection numbers a good predictor of COVID or not? What are we looking at? Are we looking at different medical care systems? Have doctors learned how to deal with COVID patients? Have we better staff and equipment? Have we different susceptibilities in the segments of population less affected, but result not in higher infection rates among the older, apparently? Has SARS-CoV-2 evolved, became less dangerous? These are questions. Have the host management measures, isolation, restricted mobility, distance, masking, etc., contributed? How much each of this has contributed to it? Do we have the necessary answers? Are we doing the necessary evaluations to answer these questions? So with that, I stop sharing and will enter in my role as a moderator and pass this on to my panelists.
Angelica.
The two questions are, yes?
Angelica, I hate to interrupt you, but there's a nasty wind behind your voice every time you speak. So if you have a chance to swap to a headset, please do. The microphone.
Okay. No, I don't.
Yeah, now
it's better. Better now?
Yeah, much better.
I think what was again was a piece of paper sitting on my computer here and covering, the ventilation of my computer, which is running hot as well.
Right.
So
good.
Better than I prefer this. All right. So please, Michael, my first question to you would go, and I think some of the participants in the audience have also asked that. The question, so what? zoonosis versus lab origin. What would make the difference? And please, the others can answer that question as well. What would we do different? What consequences would we have to draw from whether or not we know what is the birth certificate of that virus? And how could it inform better policies? Please, everybody, feel free to answer if you want to say something to this.
Yeah, obviously this is a very core question really to the whole issue, I think, for me, because if it's a zoonotic origin and we identify certain human practices, as you listed, Angelica, whether it be intense animal husbandry and agriculture or wild animal markets or so on, if we can identify how, if it was a zoonotic origin and we can identify a progression from animal to human with intermediate animal hosts, whatever, and that this stemmed from certain behaviors, you could try to then put in place different social structures to avoid that. If you, however, identify that this was a deliberate manipulation and release from a laboratory, then that points to a failure in science and science policy, especially allowing gain-of-function research, which for me is of no value whatsoever. You don't need gain-of-function research to identify how a pathogen will infect and cause disease. But for me, it is, I cannot comprehend anybody who would want to deliberately create a human pathogen, and a serious one at that. And so, but if that's what's been allowed to happen, and that's what the source of SARS-CoV-2 is a gain-of-function experiment that with a accidental release, then that tells us more than ever before that we need to put a stop to the approval of these kinds of research. All funding should be cut and it should be banned. Actually, we should just put an outright ban on that. Of course, that isn't going to stop secret developments going on behind closed doors, because we know that bioweapons are a reality. But at least we can stop public money going into such research in academic institutions and stop any collaborative links across nations. Yeah, I think this is why it's important, really. And I think for me, the sad thing would be if we got the definitive proof, and probably will not. The unfortunate thing is it's unlikely that if it was a lab creation, we'll ever get to the truth, because those responsible, and it's unlikely that those responsible will come out and admit to this. There is, but if it is, then it's a sad day for science. I think this is what for me is, and how a scientist who's supposed to be there for the collective good, for the societal good, can, knowingly create a serious pathogen, knowing that accidental release, no facility, as I say, is completely foolproof, knowing that there's a possibility that this could accidentally get out and cause harm. I mean, I cannot understand that mindset.
I think you are addressing some of the participants' concerns who've been going along the line and said, well, isn't this all military and bioweapons research? Yes, most of it, that's exactly what it is, which makes it more difficult because it's behind a veil. It is classified, and public sector scientists like yourself and ourselves will never get to see it. Yeah. And well, one participant was asking whether we would just accept this and shouldn't we prevent militaries from funding, engaging and collecting results of gain-of-function research, etc. Or are we okay with the Pentagon being the world's most powerful pharmaceutical or even life science company? I'd say the answer clearly from this board would be no, we're not okay. But with any military and secret research, it is very, very difficult to stop that and put a break on that.
Yeah, I mean, because each country makes its own laws and open ones and does things secretively. And I think we can pass international laws.
Yeah.
Whether they would be adhered to or not is another matter. And this is the worrying thing, really. The societal implication of that. Are we? I don't know what the answer is really to really put an end to this kind of totally unnecessary, as well as extremely dangerous work.
Right. Any of the other speakers want to make a statement on COVID? Yeah.
I just want to say to what was said at in the last interventions, that the fact that something is happening doesn't make it less important to call it for what it is. So an unacceptable practice, human trafficking, the fact that it happens and you cannot really stop it, should you give up and just say, okay, it's fine? I think it's really important to say, no, it should be called for what it is, and just throw grit into the machine as much as possible, and at least be clear about where we stand and what kind of world we would like, rather than simply accepting the world that we are given by people who are suppressing science simply because they have more power.
Paolo Bernard has been asking some questions and he has to leave soon. So I kind of take those ahead of time before we engage more in our debate, but they also go towards what we're discussing here. He's stating, he says statements to him were made by Dr. Simon Wayne Hobson, the head of the Molecular Retroviral Institute of the Institut Pasteur in Paris. And this is how he dismissed the GOF escape theory, so gain of function escape theory for SARS-CoV-2. On the very high similarity in every genomic region of these coronaviruses, except for the S2 and the S1 RBD proteins. Do you read that question, Michael? Very high is in the brain of the author, is the response. There are 600 substitutions in the very large open reading frame, one gene between SARS-2 and RATG13. Nobody would engineer that. Why? Nobody I know has that knowledge of the function of the ORF1 to introduce so much deliberately. Rapid selection or directed evolution wouldn't produce that amount. And leave no signature. A Richard Ebright means restriction sites, no big deal. Seamless litigation is called recombination, and it's the way we made some pox chimeras years ago. Making chimeras leaves a signature and a bloody big signature. I explained that to Richard Ebright, what I consider to be a killer argument. Can you respond to that? I'm not sure I fully understand what the question is about, but Paolo Bernard could later voice it himself, but he will probably be away then. So maybe you want to respond to it now.
Yeah, I understand there are these differences. I mean, I cannot explain them, only that since we don't actually have a viable, for me, RATG13, in a way he argues against that being a proximal origin, doesn't he? By saying that there are so many differences. The fact that RATG13 has been proposed as the proximal origin virus to SARS-CoV-2, the fact that there are so many differences between them.
Right, so it's like argument versus argument, huh?
Sorry?
It's argument versus argument. I think is this
argument, and this about signatures. Yes, I've heard about these. Like I say, depending on what genetic engineering techniques you use, either you can, you know, leave some kind of indication that you've artificially manipulated, or you can do it in such a way that you leave no indication that you've been there before. And like I say, I've been doing that for years in my own genetic manipulation experiments. And it's easier to do today, thanks to DNA synthesis technology, than it ever was before. So I would say at the moment, the situation is there are major gaps there. There is no viable, no believable proximal origin virus there. There have been a few proposed. The latest one that's been proposed is the ZC45, one of these viruses that was found to have a very similar sequence again, and isolated and worked on in some Chinese military labs. But even that was put forward as a template. You know, you use that as a basic kind of starting point, and then you manipulate from there.
Right.
So I think there are too many gaps there, and while there are all these gaps there, and the fact that you can manipulate depending on the manipulation techniques you use, you don't necessarily leave behind any kind of signature of the manipulation. None of these arguments exclude the lab origin. This is what I was trying to say. You know, you've got some arguments say, oh yeah, you can get to this through this kind of possible flipping from one animal to the other, and selection, mutation selection, and so on, eventually leading to humans. But that doesn't exclude the possibility, you know, that actually, no, the fact this virus sort of almost suddenly appeared out of nowhere in December last year, unless we're being lied to, and that had actually been around for a very long time, the fact that it's almost suddenly appears,
Right.
already highly adapted to human infectivity, smacks of something very regular going on here.
Yeah.
And for me, what's holding things back is unfortunately the geopolitical fallout.
Right.
You know, politics is getting in the way of science yet again, and that's what really one of our challenges is. How do politics should be in support of science and not a kind of user abuser and getting in the way of the truth. And I think that's what's holding things back, is the geopolitical fallout that there would be from here if it was found. I'm just speculating here, obviously this is hypothesis still because the evidence is there, but say the SARS-CoV-2 was generated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, because it's easy to piece together based on past knowledge if you want to go down that route. But that work was funded by the United States, as it has been in the past. I mean, the consequences of that are globally catastrophic in a geopolitical context. So you can understand why everything was shut down. The Wuhan Institute of Virology was, you know, access to it and all that, everything was shut down, and you couldn't have access to any of their documents, their notes or anything. And that is very suspicious. That, if you want to raise suspicion, that's what you should do. And I think this is where for me, the sad thing about this situation comes from.
Right. But that leads me, or keep us a little longer at the idea of, you know, the overlap we see here with biosecurity issues, but also with the whole field of genetic engineering. I mean, and some people were asking again of the leave no trace narrative being a proof that it has not been manipulated, while on the other hand, we experience now in the field of genetic engineering that the genetic engineers say we can genetically engineer with gene editing tools organisms without leaving a trace, and that is postulated as a reason for why they are safe and we should not regulate them. Isn't that kind of a contradiction, a logic contradiction in itself? On one hand, you say we have tools to engineer organisms without leaving traces, therefore they are safe because you can't prove, and therefore we shouldn't be deregulating them because we cannot detect them, while saying on the other hand, finding no trace is proof of that it hasn't been genetically manipulated.
Yeah.
Am I missing something here, or what's the argument?
No, again, it's arguments to suit purpose, really. Normally economic ones and political ones, unfortunately, again, rather than scientific objectives. But yes, in one context.
But that would be a contradiction, wouldn't it?
It is. It's on one level, it is a contradiction of principle.
Okay.
As I say, it's to suit a non-scientific purpose. The only way you can reconcile those things is not scientifically, but through something else or something else.
Ignacio.
Yeah, just to reinforce what I was trying to say before, I think molecular biologists like Michael and others have produced enough evidence to provide plausible pathways that should be considered, right? And then the discipline that should apply here is not molecular biology anymore. I think there is a very good discipline that is the study of how science is made, and that is a science itself. Some people call it STS, science and technology studies. Some people have other names for it, but at this point, you would go into this discussion with a different kind of discipline, and that discipline would probably bring in, and I'm again not representing that discipline here, but that discipline would probably introduce two really important concepts. One is, apart from just the plausibility of pathways, which has been already laid out, the other one is the parsimony of each one of these pathways. What is more likely, more parsimonious as a response, but also the precautionary approach to the question, which one of these pathways should call more attention because of its importance in terms of precaution. So from all those points of view, I think you have a legitimate discussion among molecular biologists, but I think it is not up to molecular biologists to make a decision in policy making based on their discussion. I think it is a different kind of discipline. In this case, I think the study of how knowledge is made that should have been called in to make decisions based on precautionary principle.
Okay. I would like to also connect a little bit to when we are on this topic of engineering capabilities, leaving or not leaving traces, and whether or not that constitute safety issues or not. How is that reconciling, or how would you, Michael, as a genetic engineer, basically reconcile when you hear the theoretical argumentation of Giuseppe about the role of DNA and the mechanistic view that is underpinning that entire field of genetic engineering? Do you feel, because that's been something that puzzled us at a large, larger also in ENSSER members as well, all the evidence speaks against the central role that DNA is being given or must be given if you want to engineer it. Okay, if you engineer something, you want a predictable outcome, it has to fulfill some postulates of engineering something, it has to function in a certain way all the time, etc. And you add and construct your transgenes and your intervention accordingly, because you base it on an expectation that your intervention leads to an expected outcome. And how do you reconcile that?
Yeah.
What's your thinking on this?
Yeah, my thinking on that is, and this is one of the things that was, I think, on one of Giuseppe's slides, okay, that what we're beginning to recognize, and in a way we're recognizing something that was obvious, but maybe just not voiced or published, is of course the fact that the genome to bring about a given characteristic has to function as a whole. It's not the old central dogma was one gene, one protein. Now we know that the vast majority of genes in us, for example, actually encode for more than one protein. But over and above that, for a characteristic that we have in any part of our body, and as for the organism as a whole, we are talking about the totality of genes working together as an integrated network. No gene is working in isolation. So to talk in this linear fashion, one gene, one protein, one function, is completely and utterly so limited, it is meaningless beyond a certain very, very basic point. Because obviously you still have a gene that goes to RNA to go to the protein. But the thing is that, you know, if you have that one protein, it's working as part of an integrated whole, but the genes themselves are working as a part of an integrated whole, interconnected network. And their work, and every characteristic is therefore at the basis, has as its basis the functioning of the totality of the genome. Now, what does that mean? It means and again, further on from this, the whole, the functioning of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts on every level. Every level of the organism, the functioning of the whole is greater than the part. And so you can never predict the functioning of the whole by just focusing in and on the functioning of one part. Impossible to predict the functioning whole from the parts because it's something greater than that. So what does that tell us?
Right.
As well, it tells us two things. If I can, I'll quickly move on, allow somebody else. Firstly, that if you change one part, you will alter the functioning of the whole in an unpredictable way, completely unpredictable way if you change the part. And so it tells us that this whole idea that you were mentioning, Angelica, and which Giuseppe was emphasizing about this very limited linear, one gene, one protein and so on, and to give a predictable outcome is completely and utterly flawed. And actually will give you the opposite. It will give you something that's unpredictable rather than predictable. And so this, but as you say, you know, what's driving this whole, you know, any manipulations now, whether it's transgenics or genome editing in food, you know, in crop production or manipulating even simple viruses. I mentioned that one example, how back into the 2015 paper from the Wuhan and the North Carolina project collaboration, they basically fused a bat virus spike protein gene with a mouse coronavirus backbone, and they got something that could infect humans. Bizarre. That should never have happened. They should merely have conferred on this mouse virus bat infectivity, but they didn't. They ended up with human infectivity instead. The whole was functioning greater than the parts, even in this very simple type of organism. And when you go to more complex layers of life, then it becomes this linear thinking central dogma becomes even less appropriate. So yeah, absolutely, we need to get away, as we trying to discuss, we need to get away from this very narrow, simplistic central dogma type thinking and embrace the wider, more holistic picture of what life is and the organisms of life, what organisms are.
Can I?
Sure.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think you clarified from the point of view of a practitioner of molecular biology the point. I would like to stress two facts. First of all, that the trouble is perfectly well illustrated that Collins, who had been working in the 80s and 90s entirely in the central dogma, one gene, one protein assumption, that in 99 thought we had 80,000 genes, getting wrong both the number of genes and the number of proteins. He was then head of Human Genome Project, and today he has been renewed to be head of the national NIH, National Institute of Health, handling 30,000 billions every year of research funds. I mean, that's the problem we have today. I mean, those molecular biologists who are in power handling public funds, even worse in private funding, even worse, have been grown, have been showing those kind of results in the 80s and 90s in particular. So that's the sociological problem, the major one we have. I entirely agree with your picture. I try to phrase it by the fact that we have to understand the major role of DNA and RNA, major role in an organism, as one of the constraints, which is in its activity constrained, canalized, and selected by the cell activity, the organism, and the ecosystem. If you consider that the pressure on the chromatin, the pressure and the torsion of chromatins modifies gene expression. That's typically very relevant in embryogenesis because the different position of the cell in an organism modifies the pressure on the nucleus, then on the chromatin, then gene expression. So that's this complex networks includes all of these. And as I said, even more strongly than you did now, in almost every cell, almost all DNA is used in part as control structure, of course, expression and control structure according to the context. I gave the example of the cave fish. The hybridation have eyes, so the DNA to produce the right proteins is there. It's simply been mutilated or what? It's not been used by a canalizing, constraining, selective effect of evolution. So this broad context. I would like to say that this linear thinking is not only a preliminary approximation. The geocentric Ptolemaic approach is not an approximation of the heliocentric Copernican approach. It's wrong. I mean, you have to change perspective. So the fact, oh, you know, many people implicitly use the central dogma because, you know, it was a first approximation. No, it's like a geocentric approach, a Ptolemaic approach. It's wrong. You have to change metaphysics. Look at the organism from another perspective, the organism in an ecosystem, which canalizes this immensely important structure, which is the molecular structure, which is in an organism. If you allow me, I would like, along these lines, to answer a question by Paolo Bernard.
Who has left already, but
yeah.
Please respond. He will check later, yeah.
Okay, the fact is that, yes, Newton goes away from the Cartesian perspective because gravitation as a instantaneous influence between planets is not mechanistic. And he knows that because he discusses the three-body problems and understands there is no way to stabilize the solar system forever as a clockwork mechanism. And the time to time, says he, God steps in and makes the clock right again. That's what Laplace and Lagrange don't want, and Fourier as well. They want to go back to a mechanical understanding by mathematics. So the idea that you can give a linear approach to any reasonable system of equation is going back to a mechanistic view, because I see at the core of the mechanistic view the understanding of any complex structure by the stacking of the simple. So linear approximation by Fourier is fantastic. You do a lot of problems that way, but not everything, almost nothing complex, is exactly the fact that you make this linear sum of the components like in Fourier approximation, and you get to the complex structure by analyzing the movement of one particle, two particles, three particles, four particles, and then you get to the whole. This was the mathematical view that represented the new mechanicism. Within mathematics, that's been totally defeated by Poincaré first, within physics, also Poincaré and Einstein and quantum physics go away from this approach. Unfortunately, biology that was deeply non-mechanicistic, in spite of some ambiguities in terminology, Darwin and microbiology and physiology were not mechanistic in the 19th century, in spite of some variations. With the discovered chromosomes, a new trend begins, and they go back. I mean, I quoted those authors that in the 60s and 70s refer directly to Descartes. I don't know the sociological part, but probably the birth of computers, the new machines, as the clocks and the devices, the pumps at the end of the 16th century were inspiring science. So, of course, computers have had a role. And when you have an alliance between financial markets using massively computers to guide our economy, you have a science using massively computers, and both projecting, one in economy, other on the world, the machine used for into the world as if it was made that way, then this alliance is very difficult sociologically and politically to defeat, in spite of massive evidence that it is false.
Well, that leads me to a question. If we seem to be agreeing here that the evidence that we do not control, or that the fundamental understanding and the foundation on which the engineering enterprise rests has been scientifically disproven. Where does this lead us with regard to that field of engineering? And where does it leave us? Because they will still continue. I mean, we understand this evidence has been compiling over decades now. So this is not falling from the sky. This is not a sudden revelation. We all know this, and we have been, you know, putting it forward. But where will it leave us now when we know they will continue pretending as if the sun circles around the earth, to, you know, use your analogy of geocentrism and geocentrism. But we know that's not true. Will it not diminish the possibility that anything useful will ever come out of it, and increase vastly the possibility while trying you can create really problematic things? And wouldn't this be even more of an argument to say that any kind of gain of function work or any kind of manipulation on pathogens with engineering tools that still rest on the principles of understanding of an outdated or at least questioned formula and understanding and concept is even more dangerous? Like your analogy where you say you give the people who think Mars, you know, the geocentric folks, you give them all the money to build rockets to try to fly to Mars based on their geocentric concept. I mean, if you give now all the money to genetic engineers, in particular now with COVID, where we're giving basically all our money, vast amounts of money, to companies that are struggling and generally trying to find and create a vaccine. Many of these companies work with completely unproven and yet documented, you know, not documented, but technologies like engineering of RNA, and companies like Moderna, where we know we're basically giving them the money to build rockets to fly to Mars based on a coordinate system that doesn't exist. Doesn't that make it even more questionable to do that? And Ignacio.
Yeah, thank you. I simply want to add to the discussion something that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is the historical context and the conceptual context that comes from the Second World War, that we are really living under the shadow of, and the advent of big science. I think it is in the background of everything we're talking about, and it really is the foundation for why it is that you need to have the one group of scientists be the ones driving, the virologists, the mathematicians, whatever it might be, driving right now everybody and everything. And so the context of the Second World War and big science is, I think, what explains a lot of what's happened with the wrong application of central dogma in biology after 1950. What happens, I think, is that biology was slated to develop in parallel to physics. If you go back to 1930 or so, when the concept of a big effort, a national effort in the US especially, was put forward, that a huge investment and monopolization, bundling of all the resources to produce radio and then eventually the nuclear program, of which Berkeley is really the birthplace. You see that biology was slated at the same time as physics to be developing along those paths. The mechanistic, atomistic way of explaining things. Now, physics progressed really well and demonstrated the applicability of their concepts, not less with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The nuclear bomb is demonstration of the power of that paradigm of thinking, that way of thinking. And so it is with that power that biology was captured into this monopolistic big science way of approaching it. And I think we continue to be trapped in that envelope, that monopolistic envelope that comes from that historical, tragic, big science approach to biology that doesn't work, where it produced something. I don't know if it really works generally for physics anymore, but it did manage to produce something very powerful that nobody could deny.
Well, we're spending a lot of money right now on technologies trying to develop vaccines that have never successfully put a vaccine out there. And
yeah, but the question is, it's the bundling.
Yeah, but we have more trust apparently in that than in proven ways of developing vaccines, which I find puzzling, I must say. You know, one could do different things, but why putting the vast majority of hope and money into that and not?
Because the genocentric story is a nice story. It is a beautiful story that that makes sense in high school, and then young people just get trapped in that, and they become professionals. It's just trapped in a very nice story.
I totally disagree with you, Ignacio, as for this. You know, the geocentric is based on immediate intuition, the genocentric not a priori. But now the new marriage is about an idea of control. You control, it's more the myth of control than simplicity per se, probably. Yes, also simplicity, but you can drive animals in the same way you can drive by AI cars, you know, you can drive humans possibly by control. Big data, you will make predictions about human behavior. There is a general, an algocracy, people that think with the algorithms like the genetic program, like the algorithms of AI, you are going to control humanity, the ecosystem, and politics and the economy. You know, the algorithmic trading is now governing us, our economy. So this alliance is the one which is very difficult to defeat with facts.
Right. I have to come back. Before I take those, I have taken notice that people have raised their hand. We will start for participants to make verbal statements shortly. There's one issue I would like to raise as a final one on the lab and zoonosis origin. A participant has posted a website and brought to our attention that there has been a whistleblower from China who has published in some platform, which I don't know that platform, where she, I believe it is a woman, says that the coronavirus was man-made and did not originate from a wet market in Wuhan. I heard of this. I must say I haven't read much about it. And Michael, just for good, you know, that we have taken note of this whistleblower, and what is your take of that?
Yes, it's actually the paper being referred to here, which was posted on it was like a blog website, because again, you know, you can't get these sorts of papers in the regular journals. I included some evidence from that paper. It's the Yanatel paper. It was on one of my slides. I referred to as one of the papers that made the point about the furin cleavage site being very suspicious and unlikely to arise from a natural mutation and selection. But in that paper, it's actually quite a long and complex paper. They actually present a number of different lines of genetic evidence, which in their view points to a lab creation and escape of SARS-CoV-2. They actually suggest that one of the viruses studied in a military institution, the ZC45, they propose that as a template. They don't say it's a proximal origin. They say that it was used as a template upon which it was modified to create SARS-CoV-2. It's a hypothesis. They present evidence why that should be the case based on sequence similarity, and the fact that I think one of their stronger points is one that I made, which was that the E protein gene sequence of SARS-CoV-2 as first reported in January was identical to the E protein gene sequence in ZC45. And this would be highly unlikely to have occurred because of the rapid accumulation of mutations. Like what they say, between January and March, several mutations in SARS-CoV-2 in the E protein were detected. So you've got to, because these are tolerated, it's not so crucial, so they could tolerate quite a lot of mutations. So for something to come up, you know, and ZC45 is something that supposedly, you know, existed, was first described 2 years before then. So the fact that you have a gene that's highly prone to variation being identical between SARS-CoV-2 and the ZC45 virus, they argued that that couldn't have occurred naturally. And that was, and it was one of the lines of evidence. They say, well, they used ZC45 as a template, which they then built on with all these other changes to give you SARS-CoV-2. Right. So that, and Jan is the person that's come out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and they use, and she's co-author of that, and the kind of, you could call her a whistleblower, since she's she hasn't got the evidence. The point is that Jan hasn't presented us, you know, we haven't got the notes from the institute there that says, oh yes, you could see this person did this person did that. We're still lacking that, but she's clearly implying that what she saw when she was there was an intentional manipulation, and that it, in her view, and her colleagues' views, there's 4 authors to the paper, that they propose, it's a proposal, it's, again, that Z45 was the template.
There is one participant who suggests, couldn't ENSSER or Dr. Antoniou make a summary of these anomalies of SARS-CoV-2 and that should be explained or clarified in order to dismiss the hypothesis that it was manipulated, and maybe send an open letter to WHO and ask them to address this. You tried that, right? And there is a mission ongoing. There was a mission started in June or July, where scientists, WHO staff and scientists went to China, and we're going to get a look at the evidence. I have never heard, other than the announcement that that's what they do. I personally have never heard what the outcome of that inquiry was, and I doubt we will hear much about it. So I'm not sure how much, you know, people have been asking this. There will not be any response from WHO.
Highly unlikely, I agree.
All right, can I move on now? I would then call on people who've raised their hands so they can make their own statement. And that will cover, I think, some of the other Q's and A's that I have not yet addressed. So I will call on the first one, which is Siguna Miller, and I will give her the possibility, allow to talk. I hope it works. Siguna, if you unmute yourself, we shall hear you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for all those talks and all the information. And so this is back to the paper by Sorensen a few months ago, where they described the alternative mechanisms of the virus to enter the cells other than via the main receptor. And this is when I first had this epiphany that the sequences might not be the key players in this entire scenario. And we talked about this, especially in this last half hour. But I started working on a paper of what this has to do with vaccine design, because very often I think that our immune system mimics to an extent how the virus relates. And if we only look at sequence-dependent mechanisms, antigen, antibody type mechanisms, we may be missing the bigger picture of how the virus operates beyond the genome as the only and sole driver. So I don't know if this is totally crazy, because I'm working on a paper, and if you think it's crazy, please talk me out of this. And if you think there's something to it, I don't know if you have any suggestions of where I could go with this paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Siguna. Anybody who wants to answer this? Michael, I think you're the next in line for this question.
Yeah, this is this is a bit outside my field, but this is a good point. Obviously, depending on the status of the individual, the reactions have been very different, and
yes,
and from extremes, yes, real extremes to nothing to death, and a whole range in between. And no doubt that this range of responses is probably depending on the status of an individual's immune system and their general health status. We know that the people that are most likely to fall to serious disease following the infection are those with other underlying conditions, including conditions where the immune system is compromised. So I think your thinking, Siguna, is on the right lines, but I'm not in a position to offer any expert advice in that regard. But I think this, as you're right, in the sense that you have to, again, look at the virus in a bigger context. It's not a blanket, if a person gets this, if they get infected, this is what you're going to get. That clearly is not the case here. And that, again, the context of the infection is unpredictable, because you don't know exactly what the status of that person's immune system is and how they're likely to respond. One where they just clear it, neutralize it quickly, nothing, to falling seriously ill.
Ignacio.
Yeah, I certainly don't have any recommendations on what to do with your paper, Siguna, but it sounds interesting. And I just want to, again, stress the importance of a population level thinking and an evolutionary level thinking as separate from the way most mechanistic medicine thinks. If you think about it as a medical situation in an individual human being, the kinds of mechanisms that you're looking for are very different than if you can accommodate for population level and evolutionary time level or ecological time level thinking. And there I would simply again state that it's very interesting to think for several different concepts. But one of them that's important is that evolutionary attenuation, in the sense that in a population over time, you can have an attenuation of virus effect without the virus really changing that much. And the mechanisms for this at the population and ecological evolutionary level might be very different from the mechanisms that people are thinking at the molecular level in the individual when the virus is first appearing in that population.
Okay. There is a second I will pass on and allow Eric Millstone now to make a statement and ask. You could also make a statement. You don't only have to ask. Eric, you would have to unmute yourself. We do not hear you in case you're talking. Eric, we don't hear you. Now you're muted. I can see that, but you need to unmute yourself. How come we can't hear you?
There's obviously something wrong with his sound connection. Maybe try the next one on the list, Ole, and then come back to Eric.
Okay, Eric, I will mute you for now, and you can try maybe separately how you can get your mic to work. And I will give Ole Ferguson. Ole, you can talk if you unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear me? Okay. Well, thanks to all four of you for some wonderful comments. I was wondering whether this might not be a particularly good time for
Hello? You are muted again. Sorry.
That was my mistake. I apologize.
Ole, hang on a second. Ingrid, you must.
I think am I unmuted again?
Yeah, that was my mistake. I apologize, Ole.
Okay,
Sorry.
all right. Okay.
Best thing is to start all over again.
Okay. All right. I was just going to make the observation that this might be a particularly good moment in time for ENSSER to make a statement about this whole complex of problems. And the reason is that, as Michael said, we don't know whether this virus is of zoonotic or of lab origin. We cannot know for sure at this time. But the moment a virologist in some lab, for example, in Wuhan, confessed that he or she did it, all other origins or possible origins will be exonerated. So there would be no question of industrial agriculture being guilty. There would be no question of destruction of rainforests being guilty. But I think that this, the COVID-19 epidemic should be treated as a generic problem, was a part of a generic problem. And I think Giuseppe mentioned this and Angelica mentioned this, that this is part of a whole series of emerging infectious diseases. And there are anthropogenic reasons for this phenomenon. And the earlier we get into the public debate about this, the less chance there is for being involved in a very, very polarized debate. Because if we can point out the various problems, according to the taxonomy that Ignacio presented, the less dangerous I think it would be for ENSSER to make these observations, as long as we keep the debate at the high ground of identifying this as a generic problem of many different possible infectious diseases.
Any responses?
I totally agree. That's why probably will be very hard, but I'm not a specialist to answer. My colleague can say much more to make the distinction. Our job is to unify the problem, and I think there is a unified perspective to overcome, to criticize, while proposing alternatives, as many of us are doing in a biological perspective. It is generic. I agree. We have to treat it in parallel, the two cases, under the same unified critique, under the same unified proposal for an organismal and ecosystemic view of life.
I must say that with this experimental symposium we're having here today, this is sort of all feeding into that thinking. We have been developing outlines in our heads, and that's why we keep a spreadsheet of all of these issues we're debating, in order to weave them together at some point into a unifying underlying conceptual paper that puts it all on the table, so that we cannot, right now it's, I agree with Ole, it's a pick and choose, you know, if you pick the lab origin one, then you run with that ball, and that's what you do, and you ignore all the rest. If you pick the zoonosis one, you ignore the lab origin and all the biosafety and security issues that are coming on. But all of them have anthropogenic roots. We have our hands in this all the time, and perhaps it is a combination of it even at the core of it.
I would like to add one more, briefly, one more issue about the debates. Very often, successes of the approach are mentioned, like, you know, we can produce hemoglobin. I mean, we can produce use genetic engineering for some successful production in practice, and there are other successes like having many data. Indeed, I quoted a major success of the Arabic astronomers who invented also mathematics to do that. So the three-dimensional trigonometry was invented in order to study skies. It was fantastic mathematics. Also, so equations were solved, new methods by this. And the major success, as I mentioned, the Alphonsine tables. I mean, they were produced on astronomical data, and they allowed Columbus to go to the Americas and navigation. Of course, this happens because a lot of people collecting data and finding correlations and mechanisms, you do discover. What is not proved by making the list of successes, that those successes depend on the wrong theory. I mean, those data that Arabic astronomers were collecting with major talent were not the result of a geocentric approach, were objective per se, in spite of the wrong theoretical approach. So we may have a list of successes of mainstream dominating molecular biology. In no way this proves that it's a result of nor proves the validity of a theory.
Ignacio, and then I move on and try.
Yeah, I just want to highlight and respond to Ole's thought on when is it a good time to make a statement and how to avoid a polarized context in which this statement might come out into the world. I think it's a really important and interesting question. And I just wanted to add to that, something that needs to happen for that to take place is that a network of trust has to be intact. One way of operating of the people who sow doubt and dissent, a very well rehearsed and recognized method, it's a method of the paid propagandists, is to enter networks like ENSSER and establish areas of discord and separation. So over the last few months, I think a very important work that has been done within ENSSER is to make sure that the network of trust that is established between scientists, where we know that the people we're talking to and talking with are people that we can trust on their intention and their social commitment and environmental commitment. And I'm not really sure, Ole, whether coming out early or coming out later would work better or worse. But what I'm definitely sure is that those networks of trust are incredibly fragile and incredibly precious and rare in the world today. So I think it's really important to recognize that at this moment as we speak.
Thank you. I will ask now Eric Millstone again to unmute yourself. You can talk according to my...
Okay, and I have different equipment now. Can you hear me?
Yes. Good.
Okay, splendid. Yes, I want to go back to something that Michael has said. I mean, Michael's analysis of the possibility of a lab source of the virus is an intriguing idea and one that I don't feel qualified to adjudicate on, but I was but nonetheless, I've often heard Michael say very wise things, but at one point I was just taken aback by his remark that politics should serve science. And that struck me as the wrong way round. I mean, it seems to presuppose that science could as it would be a value-free activity, and values should be subordinated to scientific activity, and politics should be subordinated to science. It seems to me surely it always has been and always needs to be the other way round. I mean, Michael made all kinds of sensible comments about, you know, the gain of function research should never have taken place. There ought to be regulations prohibiting it, and public funding shouldn't be spent on it. And I'd agree with that. And I'd say, you know, there ought to be regulations making it unlawful for private funding to be spent on it as well. But if you say that, surely that's tantamount to acknowledging that science needs to be constrained by, and in that sense subordinated to, values and social goals that we would endorse. And so there seemed to be a tension between different remarks that Michael has made, and so I'm inviting him to row back on the suggestion that politics should be at the service of science.
Thank you, Michael.
And I'd also be interested in Ignacio's and Giuseppe's view on that point.
Yes, I think, yes, I probably didn't quite say what I intended. Obviously,
okay, thank you.
Science should be in the service of the public good.
Yeah, okay.
And that politicians in theory as well should also be there. Obviously, yeah. They're elected representatives of society. They are there also as public servants in a way. And science and politics should be working to this common goal in a cooperative manner. I think, but at the moment, what I'm seeing is that an awful lot, because governments fund a lot of science that gets done is dictated by policies, government policy, and you end up getting vast amounts of money channeled into things that really the world doesn't need, but may generate some financial income. And that's the sort of thing I was trying to kind of distinguish, really, where politics should, maybe what I said, you know, politics should serve science, maybe was not the right term. But the policies of government policies should not be based purely, based on real need rather than simply economic gain, and that the politics should support the science to produce things that are of real societal value. I think these are the sorts of what I was trying to portray, but probably didn't do it very well.
Well, thank you for that clarification, Michael. I'm grateful the way you've put that, and we see eye to eye on that matter. Then, thank you.
I feel addressed by Eric, and I just want to tell everyone who's listening that they should listen to his presentation on the Thursday meetings of ENSSER. I listened to your presentation, Eric, with care and a lot of admiration. And I think you make it very clear that you are right, that that's the way it should be, that, that science and technique are not operating in a vacuum. And I believe that in the current situation of COVID, it is precisely this false argument that has been so damaging and has been rehearsed over and over and over in the for the nuclear industry, for the GMO industry, for the geoengineering industry, and so on, where the argument is always presented in this false format of science first and a science-based, evidence-based, data-based policy making, which of course, as you demonstrate, is a very false presentation that only serves to cover up the politics that are driving the whole situation, that is has very little to do with the way it is presented. Thank you for bringing it up.
May I add something to this? I think there is a major two-directional link between science and democracy. If you look in history, you have science when there is some space of debate, maybe a minor one, the Greek Agora, a very small one, the Russian Academy of Science, the only place where one could discuss at least mathematics and physics, not biology. And then there was some science. And you need to have a debate, a contradictory debate, which is an essential component of democracy. And also, you must have a vision of democracy which is not the one many tell us is the vote of majority. That's a component. The other component of democracy is a minority dissent. I mean, the fact that the minority group may think otherwise. And that's where science is. science is always constructed by a small group of people within a school, you know, the school of thought, it cannot be in the desert, that disagrees, maybe on a minor point. It starts saying, well, no, it's not this way, you have to go in another direction. So disagreeing is the core point of any scientific novelty, true novelty, not just technical innovation. That's a key component of democracy as well. And in order to have that, you must have a relative autonomy of researchers. So the tenure is absolutely fundamental. Some basic funding, at least for theoretical thinking, is absolutely fundamental. You must be able to explore a new path, even if it doesn't work, because this critical thinking is at the core of democracy as in science at the same time. So the two are linked by this way. As soon as you decrease democracy by saying the only thing that counts is the majority vote, then I can destroy any other position and opinion, immediately you also destroy science. Hitler was elected and science disappeared very, very rapidly, as much as democracy in Germany. And we have plenty of examples that are not as far, but are close to this when you get totalitarian attitudes. The other issue is that at the same time, science is a collaborative issue. So when you put everything on the basis of competition, competing for funds, competing with colleagues, what's very hard in science is to collaborate, and that's very productive. I mean, with people who think differently and have an exchange, that's the hard part, and that's the most productive part, which is the opposite of competition, which instead is at the core of what is proposed now by funding permanent competition and searching for funding instead of thinking for understanding.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just with shock noticed that we're almost at the end of our programmed time, which leaves us 5 minutes, but I see everybody is still on. We're not losing participants yet. I give the word, I have one more hand raised, so I'll ask Ulrich Löning, and then after that, I think we will have to wrap it up. Ulrich Löning, you can speak now. You must unmute yourself.
Can you hear that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I want to go back to Ole's comment that really it's the function, the reason for the pandemic is the way we live, putting it rather oversimplistically. I could put it another way. The pandemic is us. The pandemic is the pressure of humanity on the planet. And that gives a perfect setting for any sort of virus to have a base to be its own pandemic. You know, in other words, I'd underline Ole's point, but really we have to blame the way a large excess of humans are treading heavily on the planet. That's just that comment.
Thank you. Any of you would like to wrap it up? And I think this lifts us at the grand level again. So this might be the proper way of ending, and also offering your closing statements, addressing, you know, Ulrich's intervention, saying the causes are us, which underlines my earlier question. I think the virus is a symptom.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yes.
Who wants to go first? And then please consider this also your final statements on wrapping up this panel, so that we don't run over time too long. Ignacio.
I'll, since you are demanding that we make a statement and I didn't have one prepared, I just simply want.
Spontaneous.
I am joking, Angelica. You know that. I just want to stress the idea that part of what we don't want to do is to provide a single answer to what is a complex problem, and to try and come up with a single way of approaching it and a single way of dealing with it that is insensitive to local conditions. And I think just to pick from Ulrich's point, yes, humans, but which humans were? How do I compare in my relationship to wilderness or viral existence with someone in Indonesia, someone in Switzerland, or someone in Brazil? It's, I think, the important and difficult task here is to be context specific and context aware, and aware of diversity of approaches to a problem that is complex, and to recognize that complexity and to grow up to the challenge of dealing with that complexity as a collective of science-making people. Call us scientists if you will, but I think practice of science is really what makes the scientist. To approach complex problems as a collective of science-making people is a difficult task, but it's a worthwhile one that I'm just very happy to be part of a collective that at least is trying and maintains our network of trust in order to do so. So I just want to thank you all for being here and for participating.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Any of you, the rest, if you don't want to respond, then I would wrap it up. Giuseppe, want some final words, or you've, oh, okay, good. Thank you very much. That, oh, Michael, here we go.
Again, this is probably
almost gonna make it.
Almost. I know we've got 1 minute.
Exactly.
I just, you know, we're talking about how humanity's response to the surfacing of SARS-CoV-2 from whatever origin has been as much a contributor, if not more so. Our reaction to it has been more of a contributor to the pandemic situation than the virus itself. And I think core to that, what's come to my attention just in the last 24 hours is how flawed the PCR detection method is that you referred to. Mm-hmm. If it's based on the original PCR method developed by, I think, a German, and which the WHO has endorsed and as a result probably adopted
globally.
Well, globally, the PCR, shockingly to me, it is a completely flawed PCR analysis and tells you nothing. The rate of false positive is around 90%. You know, when you look at it, the rates of what will be a false positive will be far higher, extremely high. And therefore it gives you, in effect, a meaningless result. But on the basis of this PCR test, we've got all of this reaction. Yes, this is that has locked down societies and all the rest of it. And I think this is just, you know, a reflection of what we've been discussing. It's humanity's response to this,
right,
as much as the agents itself, which is where we've ended up in this situation, this very, you know, the way indiscriminately the way things have been locked down and society been restricted, and such faith being put into a vaccine, you know, that we don't even know if that will work or not, and whether it's even necessary or not. You know, it's really a bizarre situation to be in, but I thought I'd mention that as well about the PCR.
Okay.
Since so much has rested, you know, since so much faith again has been placed in that.
Yes, we did not cover PCR testing and the technicalities, and this is now definitely too late for doing so. But it gives me hope that maybe we have other reasons and aspects we need to discuss in a follow-up. I'm pretty pessimistic that this pandemic will keep us busy and in our bubbles, whatever form they are created, so that we will have to reach out to each other through these forms of electronic, computer, cyber, whatever you want to call it, connections to each other. I think we're running a few minutes over, but I'm wrapping it up. It was fantastic for me to listen to you all and get your thoughts. We will have a discussion afterwards, of course. I apologize to all of the people that I overlooked, where I didn't see or we couldn't cover your specific field. I'm sure that all the speakers and panelists are available to your questions afterwards and are willing to respond if there's still important questions that are burning you to get answers on. For now, I would close it down. Thank you very much. Thank you to the person you didn't see, Lucas, behind the scenes, who's been managing the technicalities here and allowing us to bring people in and keep the technique running. And Diederik, who also helped me to moderate a little bit the various panels of comments and Q&As and raised hands. If I wasn't perfect, my apologies. Next time I will hopefully do better. For now, thank you very much for joining and your patience. Most of you stayed with us, which is a good sign. And I hope to see you again some other time. I think we will keep up doing these webinars and discussion rounds while we're in isolation. Thank you very much. And stay safe and stay sane. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everybody. All the best.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.